the last video I'm making for this unit anyway is this idea of feminist perspectives on gender. And in a lot of ways, this is kind of a weird question to be asking because feminism, in a lot of ways, defined, like, the study of gender in a lot of ways exists because of feminism, because other theoretical traditions were sort of like forced to answer feminists' critique of, hey, you have assumed that women's experiences are the same as men's. And you have assumed that women like are whatever men say they are. So when you're sort of talking about like historically, like when a male historian or like someone is like, well, women's experiences in the Middle Ages were blah 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 and blah, and then you go back and you look, you're like, well, you only asked men what women's experiences are. You don't have any idea what women's experiences are. You have what men said about them, and those are not necessarily the same. And so, in a lot of ways, the fact that there's a gender chapter in your textbook and that most of you probably can't imagine doing a sociology class without one is a function of feminism. So this conversation gets a little bit odd. But by and large, one of the things that sort of happens when we talk about feminist perspectives on gender and gender sociology is sort of a questioning of not of both the gender binary, which sort of exists in a lot of other theoretical traditions as well, but also the question of value. So we talked a little bit about like women negotiating for raises and salaries and stuff like that. And that is actually an example of something that's quite common, an idea that what you need to do in order to reduce gender inequality is to sort of like fix women. And when we talk about fixing women, we're talking about essentially making women behave more like men. And that's based on this sort of assumption that the masculine, like the things we associate with being masculine and male, are superior, more desirable, more efficient, whatever you sort of want to place in there from a linguistic standpoint, and that the ones that we associate with femininity are sort of easier or softer or less relevant or less important. And part of the feminist critique, and like part of the feminist perspective on gender is to say, wait a second, why should that be true? Why should we assume that these traits are more valuable in and of themselves rather than pointing out that, hey, wait a second, we just organized our society to reward those things. That doesn't necessarily mean they are objectively better or objectively worse. Like, we can't, the two things are not connected. So that's one piece of feminist perspectives on sort of gender. The other one, though, is this idea of intersectionality. And intersectionality is essentially, at its like very basic level, this arises from the work largely of um, Black feminists in particular, although it has definitely been picked up by women of color across the board, sexual and gender minorities, class activists, disability activists. Like, there's lots of stuff that have picked up this idea of intersectionality, although it initially comes out of sort of Black feminism. The idea being, like, at its core, intersectionality is the idea that the experience of being a Black woman is not the experience of being Black plus the experience of being a woman. Like, you can't just like add those two statuses together and get what it's like to be a Black woman, because what it means to be Black is inflected by gender, right? Like, so how you express a racial, ethnic, cultural identity is shaped by gender. And what it means to be a woman is also shaped by sort of racial and ethnic identities. And this is like, that is an expression of it. It's basically a way of saying that um, the experience of individuals is way more complicated than saying like, oh, well, you are just this, because everyone's identity is layered and is shaped by a whole bunch of different things, and that there is, for example, a difference between being extremely wealthy, um, and therefore not in need of sort of pursuing professional success, and being female in a male dominated field, or the converse. Like, there, all of those things sort of matter. And what this, like the term that you sort of often hear associated with this is the idea of a matrix of domination, in that it is possible to occupy a subordinate status on a gender, like on a gender sort of aspect, right? But when we talk about a matrix of domination, one of the ideas there was to talk about the idea that perhaps, or rather that it was possible that there were any number of women who, because of the other statuses they occupy, had more power than, for example, black men. So conversations around like middle class, upper middle class, highly educated white women, um, that they were going to have more power than black men, even though we can talk about men being a relatively a group advantaged relative to women. And so this is like this idea of like it's a matrix. There's a lot of different traits and a lot of different things that get evaluated and need to contribute to this piece and to this sort of experience. Okay. Um, that is a very intersectionality is a really complicated concept. Um, the thing that you really need to understand about it for this class, is that I would summarize it as this idea of like it's not that simple, and to sort of talk about the ways that actually we talked about the idea of like master status, right? And in some ways, intersectionality like complicates the idea of master status, but we'll go with it. And when we talk about master status, we're talking about this status through which people interpret a bunch of other statuses that you have. So the example that I often use in class, and I'm sure you've heard me say it before, is you throw pretty well for a girl, right? Which is a way of saying that your gender status, right? This idea of being a girl shapes how people interpret this other status you have in terms of like athletic skill. Okay? Intersectionality essentially argues that that process is reciprocal. So, for example, like being female interprets, like shapes how people interpret this athletic ability, but this athletic ability and participation in sports also shapes how people see your femininity. And so you'll see this idea about like compensation. It's probably more accessible if we talk about this in terms of like gender and race, which is like the context in which it was originally developed. Um, and so the idea there is that like being female affects what is available to you in terms of a racialized or an ethnic expression. Lots of great examples there when we sort of talk about Islam, actually. It's a really great sort of contemporary example in that Islam is going to be experienced quite differently if you are male or female. And that's not an evaluation of either of those things. It's just that your gender affects how you experience that. And when we talk, for example, about being a Muslim woman, especially a Muslim woman who wears a hijab, a niqab, a burqa, any kind of like covering of their hair or their face, they experience the world very differently, than both other women do, right? Because they experience sort of pushback, harassment, tensions on the basis of both their presumed religion. I mean, I suppose you could wear the same sort of head coverings and garments even if you were not Muslim, but their presumed religion as well as their gender, right? So there's this idea about how that's interpreted. And that is different both from how other women are interpreted sort of in the broader environment and how Muslim men are interpreted socially. So this is one of the things that sort of comes up around intersectionality is that if you really dig into it, you can get thousands and thousands and thousands of layered inflections about how different statuses intersect. It's really, really fascinating to do so. I just want you to understand for today that, like, unless you see really compelling evidence that something doesn't matter, you should probably assume that it can intersect with other things, to create sort of unique experiences, at least in some contexts. So that's intersectionality, and intersectionality is this super crucial insight from feminist theory on gender that shows up in sort of all kinds of other aspects of sociology, right? Like we'll talk about intersectionality when we talk about the social determinants of health. So, for example, how class and social position intersect with someone's health status, with how healthy they are in a variety of different ways. So there's that piece. We're going to talk about it in all kinds of other ways when we talk about deviance, when we talk about how you receive punishment. This is a really crucial concept in sort of the understanding of sociology in general, and it is sort of due to that feminist insight in the understanding of gender.